Welcome to today's webinar on Reckoning, Repair, and Change, Authentically Advancing Racial Equity. My name's Liz Weaver, and I'm the President and Co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, and my specific responsibility is leading the Tamarack Learning Center. It's my pleasure to host this discussion and to introduce our two guests, Veronica Berganovi and Haling Price of FSG. Veronica is the director in FSG's Seattle office. During her nearly 10 years at FSG, Veronica has served corporate, foundation, nonprofit, and government clients across a wide range of issues, including health, education, and economic development. Veronica has served clients developing and implementing collective impact efforts and has partnered with FSG's Collective Impact Forum and the Tamarack Institute as a faculty member at learning events. She's also led the organization's change management efforts for diversity, equity, and inclusion for the past several years. Haling Price is an associate director at FSG, where he supports social sector clients with a focus on education and youth development. In this role, he designs collective impact strategies in partnership with community stakeholders to help them accelerate systems change. As FSG's Equity Partnerships lead, Haling also supports the firm's strategic priorities on social equity related to business development, capacity building for consulting staff, and partnerships with field actors in the advocacy community. Haling received a BA from the University of Pennsylvania. He also received his MBA from the Harvard Business School and a master's in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. So welcome, Veronica and Haling, to the call today.
Thank you.
Thanks for having
Always
us.
lovely to be in conversation with both of you.
Yeah, so we're very excited to have you join us and to learn about both of your work at FSG, both you out of the Seattle office, Veronica, and Haling in the Boston office. I believe that's where you're at.
Washington, D.C. for me, but East Coast is correct.
Oh, okay, East Coast. There you go. I'm corrected. So I wonder, before we get too much into the call, I wonder if you might just share a little bit about yourselves and what drew you to the work at both FSG and the work of community change. So Veronica, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. Well, since I was young, I tried to leave the world a little bit better than I found it in whatever small ways that I can. And I started my career in for-profit strategy consulting. But at the time I was volunteering and I served on a nonprofit board when I could, and found myself wanting to do more to apply my skills and energies in service of a better future. So that led me to FSG. I cannot believe I've been there 10 years. It's been a long time. And I've been lucky while I'm here to have started as a member of the consulting practice and to have worked across a range of industries and issues as you had described, Liz. And several years ago, I had the opportunity to start supporting FSG's efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion internally, and thinking about how we do that in our consulting work. And I'll mention, as a first-generation daughter of immigrants that come from different races, cultures, and class backgrounds, this work is very personal to me. And today, supporting our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts internally and with clients is my full-time role. So that's kind of how I came to it.
Oh, great. And Haling, why don't you tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure, thanks. So began my career in policy and advocacy, and that focus really came from growing up as a Black man in this country and thinking about inequities and why it was I experienced kind of outlier conditions as someone who had access to the kinds of opportunities I did professionally, academically, and otherwise. So I was always interested in this idea of neighborhoods as kind of a fundamental unit of social change. So that work led me to the kind of government relations and advocacy space. And the more time I spent in the communities that I was sort of supporting, the more I was excited about the idea of co-designing and really strategizing in partnership with the folks who would be impacted by these policies. So kind of transition from that advocacy perspective to this role at FSG, where I've been thinking more about kind of place-based opportunities to catalyze systems change. And what's great is, while we have some expertise, what we really bring are the sort of strategy and facilitation chops to help folks really envision what it is they want to see in the future of their community's trajectory. So whether we're looking at strategies for accessibility in early childhood and child care, or closing the opportunity gap around K-12 education system, there's a lot of really cool moments I've had where I'm able to sort of help catalyze and unlock a lot of possibilities in communities where we're thinking about kind of structural inequity. So practically, I spend half of my time leading engagements mostly around our education and youth development practice with a focus on collective impact. So again, that sort of idea of co-creating solutions. I know folks in the Tamarack universe aren't strangers to collective impact. And then the other half of my time, I partner with Veronica on our diversity, equity, inclusion work, really with more of an external focus, thinking about how we might show up differently, often in partnership with other consultancies and field actors, but generally thinking about what it means to really authentically develop as a learning organization committed to diversity, equity, inclusion, and to support clients in our efforts to sort of promote equitable systems change more broadly.
Thanks so much, guys. That gives us a perspective both into both of you as people, but also how your work intersects kind of your own personal values, but also how this work intersects at FSG. So that's I think really helpful. A couple of months ago, you wrote and FSG published the resource Reckoning, Repair, and Change. And I understand that this is part of an ongoing series of publications that have been written at FSG and with partners to deepen your understanding and our collective understanding of the importance of ensuring that equity is woven into our approaches at work. This publication is focused on the corporate sector and the benefits that businesses will accrue when ensuring equity is at the forefront. Why did you decide to write this resource?
Yeah, Liz, I'm happy to jump in on that question. And I love this question, by the way, because I think it's always important when we can make space to be explicit about the origin of where we're at. I think it's a good idea to do that, and so I really appreciate this question. So FSG and PolicyLink have been working together for the past few years to advance equity in our nation, in the US in particular. And to be explicit, when we talk about equity, we're defining that as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. So one area that we've focused on is the role that businesses can play. And as many of us know, businesses have a lot of power and influence, and therefore they're an important lever for change. And that includes as employers as well as producers of goods and services. So in 2017, FSG and PolicyLink published the competitive advantage of racial equity. And this paper put forward the case that by advancing racial equity, businesses could create shared value, so benefit for both the business and for society, by more effectively tapping into talent and customer insights throughout their entire value chain. And then earlier this year, we co-authored 2 further papers going deeper into examples of how some companies in the healthcare and financial services sectors are advancing racial equity and realizing shared value. So we went deeper into some case studies and shared more specific examples of the ways in which companies are doing that. So we believe in the potential of companies doing more to advance racial equity. We also recognized that these are 2 industries in particular that have done significant harm to communities of color. So for example, researchers omitting Black Americans from participation in pharmaceutical clinical trials or experimenting upon them without consent, doctors misdiagnosing or overlooking symptoms, lenders providing predatory financing, or banks designing fee structures that create disproportionate wealth extraction from specific communities. So yeah, we felt that companies can do more to advance racial equity, and we also felt that for it to be effective, they have to do this responsibly. And that it's really important to understand the history specific to their industry or business and address that history and not behave as if it did not happen. If we avoid that history, we risk designing products and services without a full understanding of what people truly need or want, and worse, we risk creating further harm, even if that's not consciously intended. So we felt it was really important that we name the need to move forward responsibly and authentically, and that's really what prompted this particular paper. And I'll add just a couple of final points. First, at FSG, we've been going through our own process of learning and unpacking white dominant culture and the ways in which we ourselves have not always been inclusive or focused on equitable outcomes. And there's been, reckoning and repair and change work all throughout that process. We've been investing learning around various inequities, the structures and the policies and the bias that feeds into those, and examining our own internal norms, practices, and behaviors. And part of that has been learning that often we need to be more explicit about focusing on racial equity and not appearing to be colorblind or values neutral. So again, it was really important to us that we share this perspective and encourage others to think about what it means to engage with communities of color responsibly. And then the second point I'll make here is that it's really important to be clear that this is not our idea alone. So lots of people, more than we can name, including clients over the years, partners, project stakeholders, authors and artists, community and political leaders, many different people have influenced this thinking. And the notion of reckoning and repair surfaces in many cultures, including ancient and indigenous cultures. And you can look to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission as one example, right? So we're hoping to lift up the importance of engaging authentically in this work, but we are not experts or holders of this thinking, and this is just one interpretation. We'd love to learn together with the many of you on this webinar who are also seeking to advance equitable social change. And we really encourage you to look within your spheres for ideas and action about how you can move similar work forward. You probably have that expertise within you or close to you. Of course, if someone felt it may be helpful, we're happy to collaborate and may bring in other partners such as PolicyLink or Tamarack or others as well. So I'll end there.
I think that's really interesting. I think, the things that I heard, Veronica, are that not only have you seen these patterns and that you've partnered with PolicyLink to, really engage in broader conversations about this, but you've also looked at broader conversations and taken on this work at FSG as a whole as well. And, the one thing that your comments also reminded me of is that in Canada, we're also in a truth and reconciliation process with our Indigenous peoples. And so the idea of reckoning and repair is embedded in that process with the 94 calls to action that came out of that that report, and is something that we're engaged in Canada. So I think you're right. I think there are things to look at, resources like this one and others to look at to have those kinds of conversations both within your organization and outside. In the publication, you identify 3 steps for companies to follow to be able to advance racial equity. Can you tell us a little bit more about each of these steps and some of the recommendations that you might have in these steps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll share a little bit about each step, and for each, I'll just use an example to bring it to life a little bit. The core idea is fairly straightforward. So we often have a tendency to want to jump straight to change when we see something that we think is wrong. And so we'll jump straight to what action we want to take to make that change. But especially when it comes to addressing historic inequities, it's really important that we pause first and understand that history of how we got to where we are and do some repair work before we change. Or if we don't do that, we might not change in the ways that are truly needed. So the first step that we talked about here is seeking that understanding of history and reckoning with what it truly means. And, one way to think about it is segmenting customers and understanding their needs, which all companies invest lots of resources in doing. So this is about understanding the full range of needs and experiences that sometimes we're less willing to look at, and including those in our customer research. Even with the best of intentions, we can miss things or even create harm if we're not working to be more aware of context. And there are just too many examples, frankly, of companies that create products that don't work for Black customers, from fitness trackers that don't work with darker skin to excluding Black participants from clinical trials because it simply wasn't thought about. Or, even when it is considered, failing to attract people to clinical trials because of distrust of the medical system, which is totally legitimate considering the history, right? And so it's important that we understand that to start to think about what we might do differently. And so a good example of this first step is Starbucks, which is described a bit more in the paper. For those of you who may not be aware, in 2018, 2 Black men were arrested in a Starbucks in Philadelphia while waiting for a meeting, and they had just been waiting and hadn't made a purchase yet. Within 24 hours, the company had explicitly acknowledged that racial bias had occurred. They asked for advisors with compensation, and I think that's really important to note, to help. They sought to understand what had happened, and they named it. And I'd like to read a short quote from a report by Sherilyn Iffel and Heather McGee, which I think speaks very clearly to the need for companies to understand their context. And they were a couple of the advisors that were brought in to help Starbucks really understand the place that they were operating in. So here's the quote. "The formational identity of Starbucks is centered around the creation of the third place, not home, not work, but a public space where all are welcome and people can share the Starbucks experience. But the third place cannot exist outside of the history and reality of racism and public accommodation. Indeed, the ambitious vision of Starbucks founder to create a third place in which all are welcome engages, by its very terms, the history and temporary struggle of African Americans for dignity in the public space. Thus, the awful, humiliating experience of Dante Robinson and Rashawn Nelson in the Philadelphia Starbucks provoked a necessary discussion within the company about the need to confront the full dimensions of what it means to steward public spaces in our country." So I just think that's a really powerful statement and really speaks to the need to understand the history that necessarily affects the context in which we function and operate. So that's the first step. The second step is repair. And once you have a deeper understanding of that history, you can't just expect to change some practices and behave as if it never happened, right? Those of us who've experienced personal interactions where we were hurt or lost trust with a friend or a loved one might have a felt sense of what that entails. At least I've certainly experienced that myself. So by engaging with people and building relationships, and importantly, by sharing decision-making about what's next and sharing influence and power as much as we can, that can help us more effectively integrate that awareness about that history and the lessons from that into every aspect of the business, from customer research to product design to deployment. So business leaders can acknowledge the past history, be clear that they want the future to be different, and then invest in engaging with stakeholders directly and authentically. And it's also really important to go beyond a transactional or extractive relationship to one that is interconnected and more mutual. So I really like the Pixar example from the paper here for this step. In 2017, Pixar began developing Coco. It's a film about a young musician named Miguel who goes on a journey to the land of his ancestors. And the filmmaker, Lee Unkrich, is not Latino. And there are so many examples of where a project like this could be disastrous by not honoring and reflecting culture appropriately. The filmmakers were very intentional about doing research, the reckoning and understanding piece, and about developing an array of Latinx cultural consultants that included their own team members' personal stories, as well as volunteers and external consultants. And they also did a lot of research trips to Mexico and based the film on the real life experiences of families that they interacted with there. As a result, the film was a big success. It even got praise from groups protecting Hispanic culture, such as the National Hispanic Media Coalition. And within a month, it was the highest grossing animated film in the history of Mexico. And it's just a great movie, so I hope everyone goes out and sees it if you haven't already. And so lastly, the third step is about the change, right? It's changing practices. And it's last because we feel that it's hard to change meaningfully without first really trying to understand the full context and then doing that engagement and repair work. There are many ways that companies might change practices, and it's going to be context specific, but we'd suggest that there are ways to embed a focus on equitable outcomes throughout every step of a company's business. It's also important to note that this work is not just about identifying what's going wrong for customers and then meeting their needs. It's also about understanding what's going right, or what assets or workarounds people may have created because they don't trust or benefit from existing products or services. So if we're not aware of the assets that people already have, we may duplicate them might cause harm, or at best will fail to design products and services that effectively take these assets into account. So United Health Group, as one example, they're profiled in this paper and also more deeply in the healthcare paper that we put out with PolicyLink. They are analyzing disaggregated data to better understand the needs of specific subpopulations. They're working with partners to tailor and personalize outreach to their members. And they're connecting healthcare clients to a more holistic range of services, many of it are provided by outside partners, so not provided by themselves, but they know that these affect their clients' outcomes. And so it's good for their clients, it's good for their partners, and it's good for their business as well. And another example is Prudential Financial, and they're profiled in this paper as well as in the financial services sector paper. And they are similarly changing a range of practices in the company. So they're also leveraging data, just like United Health Group, and they're doing that to improve their product offerings, including a new offering around supplementary emergency savings products that allows participants to use after-tax payroll deductions to save. So it helps them save in ways that are even more impactful for them. And they're partnering with Unidos US, who helps them better understand consumer behaviors, and they're working together on legislative and policy actions to bring more workers increase access to employer benefits plans. It's also interesting to see that Prudential Financial recognized that these changes are not just a one-time shift, they have to be an ongoing practice. So they've structured their corporate responsibility team to identify opportunities, build partnerships with outside stakeholders, and influence product development, all while reporting to the C-suite of the company, so they're being held accountable at the highest level. So hopefully these examples bring this up to life a little bit. I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Veronica. Hailing, you mentioned that FSG is working to transform its own practice as an organization embedding a focus on equity in its work. Can you share a bit about why this is important to any organization, not just FSG, or collaborative group that is really trying to work to advance equity? So maybe tell us a little more about what you're seeing both at FSG, but in some of the other work that you're engaged in.
Sure, absolutely. And it's an interesting position to be in. We don't sort of try to position ourselves as experts in DEI. You know, this is why we seek to partner in this work. So as we're looking to advance equitable outcomes, we recognize that we have a long way to go with our organizational system itself. And it brings me to a quote I often pull up in workshops and even internal conversations we're having at FSG. And that's a Bill O'Brien quote that states, "The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener." So when we think about our interior conditions, we're trying to kind of diagnose why it is we're here as a system, as an organization, as a partnership, what sort of norms, what kinds of procedures, what sorts of ways of being have we kind of lived into that have maybe prevented us from reaching the outcomes that we've wanted to achieve. So as an organization, we know at this point that there's an ethical and moral imperative to really center this work. So we know that it's critical for that reason. But if you want to make the business case, which we're often asked to do, we also understand that we can't really attract or retain the talent that we need to do this work effectively. And thinking broader than organizational doors, as a consulting shop that does provide a fee for service, we also can't compete, frankly, in the market of potential clients when there are folks getting much more sort of sophisticated with how they grapple with diversity, equity, inclusion. So we're being asked to explicitly think about disparities across populations and historic injustices. And for us, it had to begin internally before we could credibly even begin to entertain what that looked like with our external work. So I'll share a little bit more about what that's meant for FSG and maybe some broader implications for other partnerships and organizations. So beginning to look internally for us meant really engaging in a comprehensive assessment on where we were. And part of this was done in partnership with external consultants who helped us think about everything from our hiring, sort of baseline levels of diversity, the firm had across its offices, to some of the nitty gritty. In fact, one of the first pieces of this work stream that I supported and Veronica invited me to help lead was thinking about our performance review system. So annually, every consultant and every member of the operations team at FSG experiences a sort of feedback conversation. And for our consulting team, there are specific competencies. So for me as an associate director, there are specific line items that I'm shown in advance and I'm accountable to. And what we did was, instead of adding a few line items about what it might mean to sort of emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion, we really took a close look in partnership with our board and leadership team to think about, okay, what does quality performance look like given the aspirations that we're adopting as an organization? So a practical example, as a project leader, I'm often identifying interviewees to learn more about a community context or an organization. And I think traditionally our client might say, hey, here are the sort of dozen usual suspects you might want to speak to. It might be, you know, folks whose perspectives are critical, like the local, I don't know, United Way, Chamber of Commerce, the school superintendent, maybe even the head of the PTA. But what we're often missing from that first roster is a set of the key informants and folks who have that informal authority that we know goes a really long way. And they may not always be on the radar of the power can help us unlock some of the strategic challenges we're looking to address. So for us, leading with DEI in a project management context, again, super practically means we build in more lead time to think about those second and third degree connections that we're making, names that come up in conversations. So if we're talking to superintendent, we might hear, hey, you should really talk to this advocate from the community who's always at our meetings. And they may not even have a formal organizational affiliation, but there's someone who plays an important role in our system. There's someone whose perspectives we need to keep in mind. Likewise, as we're interviewing folks, we might want to test our materials for implicit bias and make sure that we're framing these challenges as, you know, structural deficiencies, not sort of human deficiencies, and how we sort of frame our challenges with our audience. So there are a lot of practical things we've done to take that snapshot of our performance reviews to think about how our consultants can be more thoughtful in the way we're planning our work and the way we're sort of shaping strategies, how inclusive our processes are as we engage community stakeholders, recognizing that in the past, we may have been on the wrong side of these dynamics and actually perpetuated harm. And over time, our understanding of what it means to operate in partnership and solidarity with the communities we serve has certainly evolved. So I think broadly, what it means to kind of examine your own practices is to have an authentic conversation. And I saw there was a question that came in around what authentic engagement looks like. I think for us, authentic really means getting into those elephants in the room, those undiscussables that are holding you back. So it means having a courageous conversation about what it is in the water in your organization that may be hindering progress. So at FSG, we named the fact that white dominant culture in its various manifestations was a hindrance to sort of creating the equitable culture, a culture in which all of our staff could really come to work feeling like they could bring their whole selves. So Veronica led the process of an internal sort of survey and analysis where we heard directly from folks around experiences of not feeling seen on their project teams, or maybe not being heard because of power dynamics, or certain lived experiences being prioritized over others informally. So we've been trying to take stock of what that has looked like and what the implications are for our work. And we know that as the conversation continues, because again, we're relatively young in this journey as an organization, we'll hopefully be able to surface some of the root causes in a way that makes this an even better place to work and ultimately has a deeper impact on our capacity to push for equitable system change. Because to do that work effectively, we need to attract and again retain the kinds of folks who are willing to ask these questions and often sit with the discomfort that accompanies this kind of conversation. So it's been necessary work. It has not always been easy, but I think for us, we knew that we needed to begin with sort of an inward-looking inventory before we could credibly go to market with any strategies that were centering sort of equitable systems change.
That's really interesting, and I welcome other questions as people think about them, and as you listen to Hailing and Veronica, please put your questions in the chat box, and if we don't get to them right away, we will have some time at the end of the conversation to surface some of those questions. So Hailing, I have a second question for you, which is
Sure.
we know that you work with a wide range of social sector organizations beyond for-profit companies. And while The Reckoning, Repair, and Change was, this version was targeted at for-profit companies. How can the information or the points that were raised in this publication be relevant to other stakeholders, such as community-based organizations and or funders? And what action steps would you have or would you suggest to those of us that work in a different sector, whether it's a community-based sector or a funder sector?
Great question. So at FSU, we have the great vantage point of experiences with clients across both the private and social sectors, and sometimes also the public sector. And my work has largely been focused on community-based organizations and philanthropy. And I think the principles very much apply here, even if we're not talking about sort of private sector sort of products, goods, or services. I think there are a lot of power dynamics and sort of historical and contextual factors that would call for an approach to reckoning, repair, and change. I think when you look at the social sector, and I can speak mostly to my experiences in the US, but I imagine this applies broadly, you think about funders who have often been committed to a particular vision, but not as formally accountable to the constituencies they serve. So as a consultant to foundations, I'm in the unique position of sometimes sort of thinking about two primary stakeholder audiences, right? They're the folks who are writing the check, our clients who have brought us in to think about a strategic challenge. So it might be, say, a place-based funder who's thinking about, I don't know, infant mortality in a certain county. Then you have the actual population of folks who are experiencing these challenges and are the intended beneficiaries. And oftentimes, their priorities are not completely aligned or understood or appreciated by the folks who are ostensibly there to serve them. So I think part of what we think about is reckoning with this history that elites and power brokers in communities, however well-intentioned they may have been, have often operated with a bit of a charity mindset as opposed to one of sort of deeper solidarity that is helping folks in a way that can often be extractive. So we're gonna ask you to come in and maybe take this survey or come in for this focus group, this community building day, and it's like, thank you for the input, we'll see you on the other side. And then we enter this black box where we then bring in the consultants to think about solutions that isn't always, they're not always tailored and not always sort of keeping that human-centered design element in mind. So when we think about sort of the dynamics with funders, we have to be cautious of kind of building in space for lived experiences, and that's everything from where we choose to hold the meetings to when during the initiative they are actually included. Is it just at the blue ribbon sort of kickoff, the ribbon cutting? Is it as a standing member of a governance body and someone with veto power because I have lived experience that should inform these efforts? So I think the first step is reckoning with the past. I remember I was supporting a place-based initiative actually here in DC, facilitating a focus group of families and young people. And I was sort of, not unveiling, but sort of helping sell community members on this vision for a safer neighborhood. And this young man, he couldn't have been more than like 12 years old, just kind of looked at me quizzically. He's like, are you really going to do any of this? And that was, you know, that was cultural, cellular, historic memory speaking. That wasn't just him, I don't think, being categorically skeptical. I think he understood that this is a community that had been a sort of laboratory for social experiments. And he'd been in, I guess, experiences like this before and heard about it. And his elders nodded and said, you know, we don't know if this is something we can trust, if you're someone who's actually going to sort of bring us along the way. And what was sort of ostensibly a strategy conversation turned into a reckoning conversation. And there was sort of an invitation to co-create this future because this isn't work that's going to be done to you, it's going to be done with you in service of your vision. So I think that's when the reckoning kind of transitions into repair and you enter kind of a trust building process. So in my practice currently, I'm often sort of unveiling or at least walking folks through what collective impact can mean in practice, because it's a word that excites community groups often, but the rigor, the sort of 5 conditions and other key elements of the governance structures and strategies aren't as clear. And when I start those conversations now, I always try to caveat that by explaining that FSG is sort of one of many organizations that has thought about this work. It's also, you know, amassed a lot of capital because we've understood how to sort of distill and productize wisdom that has lived in communities for some period of time. In fact, at the Collective Impact Forum a couple of years ago, so a sort of joint venture between ourselves and the Aspen Institute, the Collective Impact Forum had a keynote where we invited Boulay, who's a very popular nonprofit blogger. And in his keynote remarks, he shared a really loving critique of FSG's sort of approach to this work. And the quote he shared is one that I often open my presentations with. And he said, long before collective impact came out as a formal concept, diverse communities were already working together, sharing information, creating coordinating mechanisms. We have been doing collective impact way before it was called that, and we continue to. So part of what that statement represents is you all figure out a way to effectively colonize or sort of enter this space in a way that has generated profits and is certainly hopefully helpful on the net, but it's also been extractive. So for us to credibly partner with folks on the ground and pursue this work, I have to be really candid about where this comes from and say, look, this is a history that I'm sort of understanding as I'm a participant in the system. I also recognize that at the end of this conversation, you'll hopefully walk away with some tools that will render you better equipped to do this work. So this doesn't sort of negate my ability to be supportive, but I'm naming the fact that I come from an organization that hasn't always been operating in inclusive ways. And we're working to change that, and that process continues today. So I think that's when the change piece really enters, and we're saying we're not only kind of honoring that legacy, but we're going to show up in a different way so that we're leading with your perspective and the wisdom that resides in the communities we seek to serve. We're not coming in with sort of technical blueprint for you. We have a set of strategies and conditions that are flexible and adapt based on the needs and the unique context that each community we serve operates with. So I think when we're talking about funders and community-based organizations, we need to think about sort of right-sizing our approaches so that they center the perspectives of impacted populations and factor in history and often a justified sense of mistrust that we can repair over time.
I think this is, for me, what I hear from you, Haleen, is that this is an iterative process, right? That it isn't maybe just even a one-time process, but one that, we might come back to reckoning, we might figure out some steps of repair and change and then go back again. So it seems to be more emergent and iterative than a one set of approaches.
Absolutely. And I think that's just the nature of trust and interpersonal relationships too, right?
Yeah. So Veronica, what's one piece of advice that you would have for our audience today to really move the work of equity forward?
Ooh, just one. That's a tricky question. First, actually, if it's okay, Liz, I'd love to add to because I agree with everything that Haleen said in response to the question about what makes engagement more authentic. Just to add to that quickly, I'd also say listening to experiences of people who are often silenced, quieted, or invisibilized. Sharing power and influence, so Haleen spoke to that, like making sure that we're finding ways to include people, whether that's veto power or decision-making power. And then this is really connected to what you just said, Liz, but the creating feedback loops. So as you make change happen, ensuring that you have feedback loops in place so that you can continually improve and refine what you're doing, I think is also really important. So that's just an answer to that question. In terms of a piece of advice, I'd love to hear advice from the audience too, because I suspect there's a lot of wisdom in this group. But Haleen was talking about inner work earlier, and I think it needs to be individual as well as institutional. So there are particular qualities that are often less valued in dominant culture environments that are really important in this work. So some that would come up for me include humility, right, and the ability to kind of acknowledge when we're wrong or to understand that we can be wrong. An ability to make space for others and to really listen, having a learning orientation or a sense of inquiry and curiosity. So no single one of us knows everything, and together we know a lot more than we might expect. And businesses in particular have a lot of power and influence. Being in positions of power and influence can make it harder to exercise those qualities that I was just talking about. So, I would encourage anyone who's seeking to do this work to be extra intentional about cultivating those qualities in yourself or in your partners. And it is hard, but it's important that we try to better understand the role we ourselves might be playing in holding a given problem in place. The other thing, I know this is two pieces of advice, but the other advice I'd give is to seek other input. So Hailing mentioned that we brought in some advisors to help us do an assessment of FSG. And they were fantastic. I highly recommend them. It's an organization called Change Elemental. There are so many organizations doing great work about how to advance equity, everything from assessing your practices and your norms to thinking about bias, et cetera. So in addition to Change Elemental, there are organizations like Building Movements Project, Frontline Solutions, Race Forward, National Equity Project, and then Change Philanthropy and all of the philanthropy affinity groups. And there are also local organizations everywhere. So be intentional about exploring and seeking guidance from a range of folks.
Those are really great pieces of advice, Veronica. Hailing, what about you? Do you have some advice you'd like to share as well?
Sure. So a massive +1 to this notion of reckoning and thinking through your kind of interior conditions. So what it means to look in the mirror organizationally is often a lot safer than what it means to sort of interrogate how you show up as a leader. So I think that's a practice of mindfulness and reflection and hopefully a great kitchen cabinet of personal and organizational thought partners that can keep you honest on how you're showing up. So it's very individualized work. I don't think there's any cookie cutter approach there, but a commitment to that process is, I think, highly important. One piece I'll add is that on an organizational level, it's also really important to get practical and be honest about some of the trade-offs in this work. So they're the sort of like classic kind of economic trade-off between equity and efficiency. We know scale breeds homogeneity. So what might it mean to slow down in a process or to carve out more time for a process or to bring in more resources so that we can include a broader array of voices, make sure that we're sort of level set in a way that's brought our intended beneficiaries along on this process with us. That's often in conflict or at least creating tension with some very real constraints around resources and bandwidth. So I think it's very easy to make commitments at a high level to what this could look like organizationally. But as leaders who are thinking about staff and resource allocation, it's also worth some serious conversations about how we might put our money or our time where our mouth is, proverbially. So what that means practically is going to vary from one organization to another, but it's going to be some tough choices that probably require courageous leadership.
Great. Thanks, guys. Thanks for both of your perspectives, Veronica and Hailing, on this and the practical resource that you've developed on reckoning, repair, and change. I'm now going to invite our colleague Duncan back on the call, and he's been monitoring the questions that you've been submitting. So Duncan, do we have some questions from our audience?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And again, thanks to everyone from the audience who submitted your questions. If you still have a question you've been sitting on or a comment, there's still time to submit that. So please feel free to bring those forward. We touched a bit on the first question about what the word authentic kind of means in this context. The first question I want to bring to the group here is from Zara, and they ask, the internal examination of bias really sticks out as an important piece of this whole process. What advice would you give to those who want to start that, but expect to come up against some challenges? They could be personal or challenges in bringing that forward to leadership.
I can begin there. If I'm not mistaken, I think one of the most read articles on the Harvard Business Review's website over the past few years is this article entitled Why Diversity Training Fails, I believe might be the title. And the idea is that awareness of implicit bias is not enough. And often those conversations, like if you might have ever taken an implicit attitudes test where you're doing kind of knee-jerk reactions to visual stimuli on the screen, you might find, oh, I had an interesting reaction to people of color I wouldn't have expected. If the conversation ends there, you've actually left yourself in maybe a more vulnerable position than if you had actually linked this question of how to interrogate and identify bias with behavior change. So I think when we talk about internally examining bias, the idea isn't necessarily just sort of like name and shame, but it's to really prompt us to think differently about how we show up in partnership with others. Because often what we're talking about what bias practically means, how we engage across diverse teams or think about our priors that we bring into conversations and contexts that we're not familiar with. So if you can think about bringing in the sort of behavioral science, which there's a lot of great research on these days, to link an identification of biases with how are these biases showing up in our organizational policies, procedures, our resource flows, and then taking it a step further and thinking about how those things can be amended. I think that's a conversation that leaves you with some agency rather than a conversation that, you know, frankly might sort of instill some guilt and paralysis.
Yeah, a huge +1 to everything that Haling just said. And the only thing I guess I'll add to that is get help. So, you know, I think that it can sometimes feel like navel gazing, as Haling was saying, and you can kind of get stuck in that place where you're just like paralyzed by trying to figure out what you're thinking and what your own biases are. And as Haling said, it's really important that you're looking at those biases with a purpose. You're trying to undo that bias in a way that will create the space for change in practice. And it's really hard to do that on your own. So my advice, you know, my addition there is to get help and to, as Haling said, there's lots of resources. So there are researchers at Harvard, I believe, Mazur Banerjee is one of them, and they put out a book called Blind Spot. It's all about implicit bias. There are trainers and organizations that will help you look at bias and make that connection to the structural and institutional pieces that Haling was talking about. So groups like Race Forward, the National Equity Project, Change Elemental, I mean, a number of folks. There's lots of if you know, kind of Google articles and research, there's just tons of stuff out there. So definitely don't try to do it on your own and know that it's going to be hard.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question here. And this comes from an anonymous learner on the webinar. And they say, can you comment on the role of trust in this process and how an organization that has previously broken, or at least not helped, trust might step back into this space?
Why don't you go for that one first, Veronica?
Yeah, sure. So I think trust is essential, and I think it's been coming up it's been woven throughout the entire conversation. And so, you know, I think one example of an organization that has previously broken trust, and this is explored more in the paper, but one example is Barilla, the pasta company. And unfortunately, on a national public radio show, it's an Italian company, I think it was the chairman, made comments that were disparaging homosexuality. And the company faced a global boycott. There were people who decided not to work with them anymore, and they lost spaces on our Reputation Institute ranking. So this was a big problem for the company, and it got a lot of attention globally. And, you know, the company took a lot of action, including they acknowledged the problem publicly. They paid for support from advisors, and that included activists, so people involved in the gay rights movement. They created employee resource groups internally, and then they partnered with advisors who were experts around LGBTQIA issues. And so it was a process over many years, I think 5 years or more, of really rebuilding relationships and repairing that trust. And at one point, 5 years down the road, they had a company meeting where a civil rights activist was at the meeting and was celebrating with them, celebrating the progress that they had made, right? And that they acknowledged at the time that they were still in repair mode. So they still, I mean, it's an ongoing process that needs to continue. But by acknowledging what they had done and acknowledging the harm that had been created, by investing and compensating people for the time that they were asking for in order to do that repair and relationship building work, and then really starting to look at their practices and figure out what could they change across a whole range of things internally, right? It was not just a PR campaign, it was changing the way they functioned internally as an organization, that actually helped them to go through some of that rebuilding of that trust process. So that's a specific example for the corporate space. Haling, I know you've probably got good examples from other sectors as well. And if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah. Not a ton. I think that captures the I think the ethos that would drive this process across any sector. But I have seen, I think, a few examples of folks who really follow the blueprint that you described. So the sort of reckoning, repairing, and change, all of that is really an iterative process of trust building fundamentally. So for me, I think it means being really transparent about where you are on that journey, because it's hard for me to trust you if you're making grand proclamations that you're reforming, but I'm actually experiencing any different outcomes. So I would much rather have folks kind of show and not tell as they move through each stage of this journey. Committing to it is one thing for sure, but actually noticing how people are experiencing it and giving them opportunities to share feedback, which might practically mean for a funder having conversations with grantees about how those power dynamics might shift. I've heard about a few funders recently changing their language from grantees to grant partners, because that semantic difference actually connotes a different kind of distribution of power. And that probably stemmed from some conversations with past grant partners who thought differently about how they might sort of engage going forward. So giving people opportunity on an iterative basis to share that feedback, and then I think being transparent about where you are on that cycle of reckoning, repairing, and change is certainly a pathway a lot of different organizations can take to building trust.
Thank you, Haleen and Veronica, for your time today. I'm going to wrap up the call now, and really want to acknowledge both the document that you shared, the publication that you shared, Veronica and Haleen, but also the very thoughtful practice that you bring to this. I know that throughout the conversation today, I've really been listening intently and thinking about, you know, how do we use the notion of reckoning, repairing, and changing in the work that we do at Tamarack and with communities as well. So I found it really valuable to, you know, both participate and to host this call. I think I want to just quickly turn it over to Duncan for a few closing announcements. So over to you, Duncan.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And yes, again, thank you to both Veronica and Haleen for sharing your wisdom with us. It's been a really great discussion and a pleasure to sit in on. For our learners on the call, just another reminder that tomorrow you will be receiving a follow-up email from us, and that email will include a few things. First, a full recording of today's call. So if you missed anything, you want to come back to this, you'll have that link in your inbox. I also feel free to share this with anyone you think might enjoy this learning, or anyone in your network. On top of that, it'll also include a full copy of the slides and a collection of links and resources. I've been jotting down the links that we've been sharing or talking about during this call, as well as some of those organizational names. So that'll all be included in tomorrow's post-event email. As well, if you're interested in learning more about some upcoming training through the Tamarack Institute, you can visit tamarackcommunity.ca to find more free webinars like this one. And we do have 2 more events wrapping up the end of our 2019 learning calendar that I'm going to mention just briefly here. The first is called Collective Impact, Leading Theory to Action. It's taking place November 5th to 7th in Edmonton, Alberta. And it's a 2.5-day workshop designed to build your capacity to mobilize, launch, and sustain collective impact initiatives. And it's a really great way to be exposed to all of Tamarack's best and most practical collective impact resources. So if that sounds helpful or interesting to you, feel free to follow the link on the screen or in the email that'll follow tomorrow. And lastly, we've been talking a bit about trust today, and Liz Weaver, our host for today, is actually hosting an in-person workshop in Hamilton on December 6th called Turf, Trust, and Collaboration, Practical Tools for Building Trust. And it's a workshop designed to equip you with ideas, tools, and approaches to effectively engage diverse community partners and build trusting relationships. So again, you can look at the link on your screen on the Tamarack website. Thanks again to everyone who joined us on the call and shared your questions and thoughts. And yeah, please look out for that email in your inbox tomorrow. And thanks again to Liz and our guests, Haleen and Veronica. Thank you so much.